So today, one of the things I want to do is talk about all the ways in which cutting down trees can actually accumulate carbon. And so why do I want to do this? Well, one of the first reasons is that as someone with a forest science background, I think this is always a topic that we're struggling to convey, that forest scientists, their goal is not just to cut down trees, they're not loggers. Their goal is usually to create a healthy forest, and a lot of the time they spend a lot of time focusing on making sure that trees grow back properly following some sort of cutting. But as I moved into the sustainability space from forest science, I found the attitude even more pervasive that the best thing to do is just leave nature to grow and hands off is best. And that's really often not the case. And I mean, one of the reasons it's not the case is that we are not usually dealing with purely natural systems. We're usually dealing with systems that have decades, if not centuries, of human involvement. Now, let me start with the obvious caveat, which is that in most instances, not cutting down trees is the best way to accumulate carbon. So right off the bat, I am probably talking about a minority of like the cases. That being said, there are a whole lot of cases when it is good to cut down trees for carbon or for ecological reasons. Let's start with the first kind of like batch case of when you want to do this. And this largely falls into preventative measures. What do I mean by preventative measures? If you can go and cut down some fraction of trees in the forest and protect the rest of the forest, that is something that is worth doing from a carbon perspective. And right off the bat, the easiest thing to name is fire management through fuel reduction. So a lot of the forests on the west coast of the United States, for example, have a long history of fire suppression. A lot of fuel has built up. There's a lot of ladder fuel from like very small trees and other little small vegetation that's been sitting there. And this represents a real fire risk. If fire then comes in, it could kill absolutely everything. It could even convert the whole area to not being forest at all. And so it is best to remove that little bit of fuel in order to prevent larger fires. I think everyone is kind of aware of this. And so let's move on. Invasive species removal is another obvious example. There are several species of trees that are like relatively invasive. Removing them can be good for the forest environment. Here in the Pacific Northwest, for example, holly is a good example of an invasive tree species. It is an understory tree species that outcompetes other, understory vegetation. It's not really removing any carbon itself, and it's not great. So cutting holly makes a lot of sense. Sanitation harvests are another good example of preventative measures that could benefit the forest at whole. What do I mean by sanitation harvest? Well, if you know that a certain like tree is sick or a certain tree is definitely going to die because of an insect or something like that, it could be very beneficial to cut that tree out of the forest. So let me give two examples. On the east coast of the United States, there are several species of like invasive bug or invasive disease that are kind of sweeping across the country and killing trees as they go. And emerald ash borer is probably the best known example. It's got about 100% mortality rate. So, every single tree within the path of emerald ash borer beetles are going to die. If you have a bunch of ash trees within the path of emerald ash borer beetles, and like on the north end, I think that they're like creeping up into like New Hampshire right now, it makes sense to go in and take out the ash trees. By doing that, you're doing yourself two favors. First of all, those ash trees will absolutely die, so it makes sense to use the wood for something good. Second of all, by taking out the ash trees, you're kind of creating like a break that could prevent the beetles from spreading further or at least slow them down a bunch. So the properties behind you, so to speak, could benefit from you removing and cutting down the ash trees. Another really good example is sudden oak death. This is a disease that's spreading up the coast of the west coast of the United States. Every time that an oak tree is infected by sudden oak disease, it will die. It's 100% death, and it will pretty much absolutely kill all of the oak trees around it as well. And so what foresters are doing right now is, whenever they spot sudden oak death, they go in and they cut that oak tree, and they also cut all the healthy oak trees around it, because we absolutely cannot let this thing continue to creep up the coast. Otherwise, all of our coastal live oaks will get murdered, will get killed. So there are lots of these instances in which it does make sense to go and cut down trees for sanitation purposes. All right, so that handles the kind of the preventative aspect of cutting trees to prevent like further losses. But there's a more kind of cold and cynical reason that cutting trees down often is beneficial for carbon accumulation. Now, when we cut trees, if we use that wood for long-term wood products or for carbon storage, this is a really beneficial way of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So you can cut down trees and use the timber for housing or for furniture, and that carbon is being removed from the atmosphere for decades, if not centuries. The other thing you can do is you can cut down trees and use the timber for things like biochar or bury the timber in like a wood burial scheme. And once again, that can be like centuries or even millennia that carbon is stored. Now, let's think about the two alternatives here. Imagine a scenario where you're growing trees up, cutting them down or cutting some fraction of them down every like couple of decades, burying the wood underground, and then letting more trees grow in their place. That is always going to accumulate more carbon out of the atmosphere than just leaving like a single cohort of trees to live. One of the reasons for that is that trees grow along an S curve, and once they kind of go past their peak growth rate, they kind of slow down, and they kind of accumulate carbon a lot slower than they historically were. So it kind of makes sense to keep trees in their peak growth window and kind of continuously take a little bit of wood off of that and then use that wood for, you know, either building houses or burying that wood or whatever it may be. In fact, this is an enormously efficient way of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And here's an example. If over the course of 100 years you plant trees and they grow up to kind of full size, maybe they'll remove something like 400 tons per hectare over the course of that duration, that 100 years. Well, a full-grown... But if you're able to do that maybe 3 or 4 times and kind of cycle, and each cycle you take those kind of mid-sized trees and you bury them, you could end up accumulating maybe 700 tons over that same 100 years. In general, productive forests can sequester 20 to 30 tons of carbon per hectare per year if they're in that kind of peak productive rate of their lifespan. Now, managing forests to remove carbon from the atmosphere is not something that we do today, but it is probably the most efficient way of actually removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And it's very ironic because, you know, human beings spend a lot of time and energy engineering ways to like pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere with like gigantic machinery, but just using trees to do it would be a lot more efficient. If we were willing to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere with the same like industrial intensity that we're willing to like produce toilet paper, then you know, we would have a very efficient system for removing CO2. You might be saying to yourself, but Elias, you're being hypocritical here. You've been very critical of carbon projects that are just these monoculture plantations. And that's not entirely true. What I've been critical of are carbon projects that are monoculture plantations that I think are being planted anyway, not for carbon. But if you're going to use a monoculture to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and use it just for carbon storage, I think that is a fantastic way of actually removing carbon dioxide en masse. And it would be very hypocritical of me to be completely against all monocultures because I do wipe my butt with toilet paper, and I do eat wheat, I do eat corn. I use products from monocultures constantly. So this is potentially a way in which we could be very efficient about removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Anyway, let's move on past this point because carbon credit buyers don't seem to be willing to make that case to their customers. Another way that cutting down trees can be efficient is something called capturing mortality. What I mean by this is that tree species themselves all have a lifespan. We tend to think of trees as being like very long-lived, like infinitely old. Most tree species have a relatively short lifespan that is often kind of comparable to human beings. A lot of deciduous tree species on the east coast of the United States, you know, those lifespans are usually 100 to 150 years. You know, one good example is balsam fir. This is a tree species that's kind of like in the northeast of the United States or in the east coast of Canada. That has a lifespan of only 80 years. So if you have a stand of balsam fir trees that's 80 years old, those trees are going to die. And it makes sense for you to go and cut those trees and use that wood for something rather than like just letting them die and decompose on the site and kind of, you know, waste the growth that occurred there. When trees decompose, the carbon dioxide just goes right back into the atmosphere. Now, another reason that cutting down trees can be beneficial is that some of the time when you cut down trees, the remaining trees actually do better. this can happen in a lot of different circumstances, but one of the more common examples of this is in young, very dense forests. Now, in young, very dense forests, trees grow up together, and when they get to full size, they start competing with one another. So they start like fighting each other over resources, and they're really densely packed, and they put a lot of their effort into like either growing really tall or kind of fighting each other like for canopy space. When trees are trying to compete with each other, they're not growing optimally necessarily. And so it's been shown that you can actually go in, maybe if you remove a third of those trees, you can actually speed up the growth of all the remaining trees so that it's faster than not going in and cutting trees at all. And you can actually remove more carbon dioxide this way than if you didn't do anything. So eliminating competition from a really dense forest is one way of potentially accumulating more carbon in that forest. Sometimes this is called pre-commercial thinning, although even commercial thinning can sometimes have this effect. And that brings me to my next point, which is that when you do thin a forest and you remove that competition, what almost always happens is that the remaining trees are happy now that they have more space and more light. And what you see is what's called a thinning response, in which the remaining trees will then grow a lot faster over the subsequent years. The thinning response is observed in almost every type of forest that you do some sort of like forest harvesting in. And if managed properly, if you're using the wood that you remove from the forest, like for sustainable products, or again for wood burial biochar, then you can actually create a situation in which you're encouraging all the trees on the site to grow faster. So the thinning response can kind of be taken advantage of in a kind of an optimization sense to remove carbon dioxide and keep trees growing as fast and as efficiently as possible, and cut down on like the kind of unproductive competitiveness that trees can do if they're too close together. Okay, so that tackles my my arguments for cutting down trees for an efficiency sense. But let's talk about the ecological rationale for sometimes cutting down trees. One of the more important reasons that we need to cut down trees sometimes for an ecological context is to encourage reproduction of baby trees. In order for a forest to kind of be healthy and kind of be sustainable over the long term, you need to have young trees, mid-sized trees, and old trees in a constant cycle, where old trees are either being thinned and removed or they're dying, and that leaves then a gap in the canopy that light can then get down into that, then young trees can grow in. Young trees can't just grow up in a fully covered forest. They need some like light from the sun to reach down to the ground in order for them to survive. Well, here's the thing. When human beings go around and we plant trees like for reforestation projects, or we plant trees in really dense clusters even for timber, what happens there is that the trees all grow up in an even age situation where they're all growing up at the same period of time. And then you end up with like a full-size forest that has absolutely no light that makes it to the ground, because all the trees grew up at once, and you have a very like uniform canopy, and no sunlight can then get to the ground. And what happens there is that there isn't an ability for the trees to reproduce. So you end up with a really bad circumstance where you've got full-grown trees, but they're not able to reproduce. They're getting older and older and older, and at some point they could, reach senescence and die, or they could get blown over or something by a hurricane. And then, there's nothing to take their place. There's no new generation of trees. And so it's really quite essential for like good forest health, if you're dealing with an even-age planted forest, to like thin it like midway through its life cycle so that young trees get light and can then grow up, and you can then have like a more natural looking circumstance. My concern with a lot of these reforestation projects is that they kind of forbid timber harvesting, or they forbid harvesting altogether. And what they're doing is then, of course, planting this really like dense set of forest that's going to grow old, and after 80 to 150 years, it's all going to die, and the site could just revert back to like a field. That brings me to my second point, which is that thinning can often be a means, which is that harvesting trees can often be a means of kind of promoting an old growth-like state before it would otherwise happen. What do I mean by this? Well, again, if you've got this forest that's kind of been planted by human beings, or has kind of in some way grown up from like an old field, like an old agricultural field, there may not be much like actual like gaps in the canopy, and there may not be any forest regeneration. So it's very important. But old growth forests, they usually operate on gap dynamics. It's fairly important for you to potentially go in and nip out some of those big trees so that you create gaps and kind of create this kind of cyclical system. Now, this will happen naturally over the course of hundreds of years. And so we can actually kind of jumpstart that state by going in and nipping out trees and kind of creating this uneven age system that's much more reminiscent of an old growth stand. And that's an important point that I want to make, which is that forests that are left to their own devices after being planted often don't resemble old growth forests much at all because of this problem. Whereas forests that are kind of thinned kind of infrequently, maybe every 15 years they take out 30% of the wood, they often are much more similar in characteristics to old growth forests because they kind of have an uneven age system and they kind of have multiple cohorts of trees that can be much more beneficial for wildlife. So in that sense, like cutting trees in forests, especially forests that have some history of like human tampering to them, is often very beneficial ecologically. Let's move on to my final topic here, which is the financial benefits. Here's the thing. Leaving land to just sit is deeply financially unpalatable. No matter where you are, whether you're in Uganda or in, New Jersey, like we said, just leaving land to sit there without taking any money off of it is a really difficult thing to do financially for whoever owns the land or, in general. Carbon credits are ideally supposed to be a means to kind of incentivize that, but carbon credits do not sell for enough money. I think it's been calculated by Pachama, for example, that even in like the developing world, it costs something like $80 a ton to just plant trees and leave that land like to sit on its own, not deriving any other financial benefits off of that land. In most cases, we need to be harvesting and cutting some number of trees off this land in order to allow forest conservation on that land. And I'm not talking about like managing the land like super industrially. Maybe it does just mean like a 1/3 thinning every decade or two, something that you could really barely even notice. But it's really important as a financial mechanism right now because carbon credits are just nowhere near worth the value of the land. And I have to say, like some of my favorite carbon projects, like REDD+ avoided deforestation projects in like tropical countries, have some level of like forest harvesting component to them, where you can see some like very like small sustainable harvests. And this is fine. I mean, it's absolutely fine to take native rainforest that hasn't been touched and remove like 10-20% of the carbon from that and allow it to kind of naturally regenerate on its own. This is an impact that is not really going to be felt ecologically in the forest. To some extent, you can probably even do some good by like planting, really rare trees and encouraging those trees to grow in those sites. And it makes the finances of these projects work a lot better. And let's be honest, there's another component to this, which is that developing countries often don't want to be told you can't use your land for that. Because, in the United States, for example, or in Europe, we use all of our land to its maximum potential for the most part. But, Brazil or like Cambodia, they don't want to be told, well, half of your country just needs to be just off the table. You can't do anything with it. So, coming to a compromise where they can like still extract some like relatively sustainable amount of timber off their land is a really good solution. In general, I think what needs to be pointed out is that just given the state of the carbon markets and the uncertainty out there, some level of harvesting trees is needed in order to make forest conservation or restoration financially viable. Okay, so just to reiterate, we talked about 4 major topics for why cutting down trees can lead to more carbon. First is preventative measures like fire management or removing like invasive species. Second is efficiency, like causing the trees to grow faster or causing like taking the wood and using it for carbon beneficial means. Third is ecological reasons, so creating a more old growth looking forest or allowing trees to reproduce, which is really important for these reforestation programs. And the fourth is financial reasons, which is that without cutting some trees, it's often impossible to make these like conservation programs work. So those are all good reasons, and I hope I didn't get too far into the weeds of forestry here.